They saw black-eyed young girls with painted faces smoking little cigars, going arm in arm and eyeing them brazenly. They saw the governor himself, erect and formal within his silk mullion sulky, clatter forth from the double doors of the palace courtyard. And they saw one day a pack of vicious-looking humans, mounted on unshod Indian ponies, riding half drunk through the streets, bearded, barbarous, clad in the skins of animals stitched up with thews and armed with weapons of every description, revolvers of enormous weight, and bowie knives the size of claymores, and short two-barreled rifles with bores you could stick your thumbs in, and the trappings of their horses fashioned out of human skin, and their bridles woven up from human hair and decorated with human teeth, and the riders wearing scapulars or necklaces of dried and blackened human ears, and the horses raw-looking and wild in the eye, and their teeth bared like feral dogs, and riding also in the company a number of half-naked savages reeling in the saddle, dangerous, filthy, brutal, the whole like a visitation from some heathen land where they and others like them fed on human flesh.
Hi JVH, how are you doing
Hi,
today?
hi, Candy. I'm doing pretty good. How are you?
Okay. I know we both have had a couple of very busy weeks. Lots of
So
time
busy.
but lots of time to let this chapter kind of sink in amongst our days. I know I've
It's,
I know I've spent a lot of time with it on and off, you know.
yeah, me too, which is, funny because it's so short and it's such a transitional, well, it is like a very pivotal, very transitional chapter.
I agree completely. And there's a lot to chew on in it. Um, I think we're going to talk about some of the plot today. We're going to talk about some concepts in structure. We're going to talk about how the novel is structured overall. And we're going to talk maybe about gambling, the story within the story in this episode. And we may get to distributed cognition, but I know we have a lot to talk about history. We're going to kind of cover some of those things. And if we have time at the end to get to distributed cognition, we will.
Yeah, this is the chapter where the kid joins the Glanton gang. This is like the absolute,
Right.
pivotal chapter. It's after this, everything that happens is somewhat grounded in Samuel Chamberlain's story of his time with the Glanton gang
Mm.
in his memoir My Confession, or Recollections of a Rogue. But everything that took place before this is not in Chamberlain. Like there's no Chamberlain does not tell the story of when he was 14
Right.
and left Tennessee or anything like that.
Right.
So all of the stuff that happened before this chapter was fictionalized, and we have 6 chapters at the beginning of the novel, and we have 4 chapters at the end of the novel, and these are framing the the story that McCarthy gets out of Chamberlain's My Confession.
Do you think he took too long with the six chapters, or do you think it helps us get used to the kid? We get familiar with him, perhaps? Do you think that's part of it?
I think it's totally deliberate. I don't think he took too long. It's a very, Shakespearean sort of thing, right? You don't bring on the main story
Mhm.
act one, scene one, right? You got to wait and let the audience wait until, the main event
Mm.
really starts happening. So,
Mm.
and it's beautifully structured. Like when you think about the order in which the main characters are introduced in these first 6 chapters.
Mhm.
We've noted that in chapter one, we get 3 of the main characters of the novel, right? We get the kid, obviously, the protagonist. The first other main character that the kid meets is the judge,
Mhm.
and then after his first encounter with the judge, in Reverend Green's revivalist tent, right after that he meets Toadvine, right?
Mm.
Um, and then after he and Toadvine have like probably killed old Sydney and set fire to the hotel. You know, the kid wanders off again alone. But how does he reunite with these main characters? It's he first meets Toadvine, and then Toadvine basically facilitates him, you know, joining the Glanton gang. So we
Hmm.
have this kind of neat progression, you know, where the kid first goes, you know, judge Toadvine, and then in chapters 5 and 6, it's like Toadvine judge. So we,
Hmm.
you know, to me, this is like a kind of a beautiful figure of a chiasmus, right? A chiasmus is a kind of a figure of balance that is really based on a kind of antithesis, you know. So we have, you know, in this kind of order, kid, judge, Toadvine, Toadvine, judge, we have this figure of a chiasmus. Um, you know, I'm not really 100% sure why
Mm.
McCarthy structured it this way, but it definitely seems to be structured this way. And, you know, as a figure of antithesis, this just kind of plays into, for me, anyways, the kind of allegorical construction of the novel as an entirety. You know, we started this podcast with our little, you know, singing of childhood in Tennessee, the childhood in Tennessee, you
Yes.
know, and so that kind of counterpoint, that was a sort of a image of a counterpoint, or also a kind of a chiasmus.
Hmm.
And now we have another figure of chiasmus. So these figures to me kind of are prescriptions to the reader to read the everything as in some sense as a kind of negotiation between extremes.
Hmm. Hmm. Very interesting. And I mean, the inverted order also tells us it, like unconsciously is telling us to look at it from another side, maybe when you have inversion in art. I'm hearing that I really wasn't familiar with the term, to be honest with you, until you introduced me to it. And I see it as a partly an inversion, um, which makes you think, it's making you think twice, even as you read along. But I also happened to coincidentally, a few years ago, start writing down and really blindly orders of numbers of characters in a chapter and orders of them appearing. Not sure what I was going to do with that. But it was a form of my counting. Like, was there a number of characters coming and going, or did it symbolize something, Um, or allegory, if you will?
Well, you know, you said the word inversion,
Yes.
and so inversion actually, you know, in I don't know, like Renaissance poetics,
Mhm.
inversion was another name for allegory.
Oh shit, isn't that funny? I
Yep.
guess that makes sense because it is like as above, so below in my world of allegory, right? Which we're trying to find. I'm sort of still learning how does this cross over, or does it cross over between you and I? But yeah, in the Emerald Tablet and in Hermeticism, it would be part of as above, so below, you know? Um, which, yeah, and I
Which,
think
you
that's
know,
so
like as above, so below, is basically another way of saying microcosm, macrocosm,
correct. Yes, yes,
right?
it is.
And you know, for in a book called Allegory and Violence, the author Gordon Teskey says that the microcosm, macrocosm analogy is kind of the foundation of allegory.
Mm, mm, interesting. And would violence always have to be involved in that?
I think for Teskey, yes,
Yes.
because again, it kind of goes back to the stuff I was trying to articulate in maybe the epigraphs episode.
Hmm.
Um, in that the violence of allegory is always there's always a symbolic violence to allegory,
Hmm.
because what the allegorist does is he or she um, or they I'm trying to figure out a way to put this.
Yeah. We,
They essentially drive a wedge into the usual meaning of a word, and may substitute another meaning,
Hmm.
or they may put the usual meaning of the word in tension with another possible meaning of it. So there's always a kind of violence in allegory that separates the literal from the figurative in any given word.
Okay.
Um, and then again, so the violence is on the one hand kind of a divisive, where it
Hmm.
separates meanings, but then the violence is also fusional because it fuses you know an improper meaning to a word or something like that. So the violence kind of works to divide a meaning, but also to yoke alien meaning onto something else.
All right. That
If
that's
that kind of makes sense.
it does to me. It does to me. And I think it also makes sure that I don't take it necessarily violence like a John Wick movie, you know, like film violence necessarily, although it could be. The violence could be disruption, right? But
I think because of the symbolic violence,
yes.
allegory has a tendency in its content or its narrative to also, have to be violent in in its representation or its narrative.
Yeah, and I would say that I find that in mythology too. You know, I've mentioned before that Hamlet was a very sad story when I first read it, but when I got older and was learning about allegory or hermeticism, I realized it's actually a beautiful rebirth story. Yes, it's sad that Ophelia and Hamlet all had to die, but the corruption was so much worse. It's almost like Casablanca. You know, we're not worth a hill of beans. It was worth their sacrifice to actually help the entire community. That kingdom had to die. It had to have a rebirth. So they were the ones that had to burn and die in order for rebirth to happen. Um, Very interesting. Uh, you know,
Oh, sorry.
go ahead.
Well, I did want to talk a little bit about the character of Toadvine.
Yes,
It's such a great character. Um,
he is really
they're
a
sort of like,
wonderful.
the kid's bosom buddy on the one
Yeah.
hand, sort of like, the Enkidu to the kids Gilgamesh, or, like they're fast friends, brothers of the flesh.
Yeah.
But, it's really interesting, I think, where McCarthy got the name of the
Mm,
character
mm,
Toadvine, which is
mm,
from like an 1854 plantation novel called The Master's House by Herman Melville's kind of frenemy named Thomas Bangs Thorpe. Thomas Thorpe and Melville, at some point in their lives, both worked at the New York Customs House. Speaking of, tariffs.
yeah.
Um, uh, Yeah, and I guess, Thomas Bangs Thorpe was a little bit of a, shady character,
Mm,
was like taking bribes and stuff like
mm,
that. And
mm.
Melville was a very saintly, righteous type of person and
Ah,
didn't and looked down upon, I think, Bangs Thorpe. But Bangs Thorpe has this really weird novel called The Master's House, which is about, it opens up with a southerner named Mildmay, and he's gone to the north to receive his education. And it begins with his Mildmay's kind of graduation ceremony and his preparation to return south to basically run the family plantation.
mm,
And so he returns south. I think it's in Louisiana. I probably should have noted this
mhm,
beforehand.
mhm,
But so he returns to the plantation, and he's a Southerner, so he believes in the peculiar institution of slavery, but he also received his education from the North, so he also kind of, wants to institute a kind of kindler, gentler form of this institution.
mm,
So he runs into a little bit of difficulty with one of his overseers. The overseer would be, the worker who keeps the slaves in line,
mhm,
and often, with violence or definitely with the threats of violence. But the overseer at Mildmay's plantation is somebody named Toadvine.
mm,
And Toadvine, the very first time we meet Toadvine, he's actually quite annoyed with his new employer because the Mildmay like interferes with Toadvine's desire to whip a slave. Um, and so at one point, the Mildmay goes on a trip, and Toadvine is like, now that the cat's away, I'm gonna, this mouse is gonna play or whatever.
Mhm.
So we get the sort of a first scene of Toadvine um, working on his whip. And this is, let me read
Hmm.
a passage from
Yeah,
this.
please.
The overseer, so that's Toadvine,
Right.
and the very morning on which he saw from his station in the field that Mildmay had departed on his journey, he returned to his house at the head of the quarters, and taking down the proscribed lash, he carefully and artistically proceeded to soften its material, and by repeated twistings, wringings, and drawing it through his tightly grasped hand, he brought it at last
Mhm.
to a satisfactory state of toughness and pliability. It sounds like a little bit phallic,
It
but
does.
he's working on, his whip because he has a particularly personal hatred for one slave.
Oh.
So he wants to like torture this slave. So he so it's really interesting that the kid and Toadvine meet in this Mexican prison,
Mm-hmm.
and they're sort of like beset upon by this sadistic or perverted overseer with a
Mm-hmm.
whip, right? A quirt.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I would say that just the context of Toadvine's reunion with the kid is, and in the context of this overseer with a whip, um, does kind of suggest that McCarthy deliberately drew the name Toadvine from this plantation novel.
That's
Um,
amazing. It also is as the kid and Toadvine are reconnected, McCarthy is reconnecting with that storyline, and that history. And we already know he loves Melville. And he would probably know that those two were frenemies or were or something. It's so
Probably.
fascinating. And you've mentioned the overseer, which reminds me, of course, so in the plot of this chapter, he's called Brass Teeth because he's got all these gold teeth long before rap music. He's got all this brass
It's the
teeth. And I
the
love it,
OG grill.
the OG grill, and I love it that they call him brass teeth, and that they're quite disgusted by him, and it's almost like Toadvine's getting some literary reincarnation and karma acting out because he's now placed as the victim instead of the overseer. So there's something quite magical about that too. And when you're telling
Absolutely.
me about this, I looked up O'Donovan, and he was a slave owner too, and he had because he's mentioned in the chapter and in the headers, and he was a uncomfortable slave owner. He wanted to end slavery too, and yet he was a slave owner. I can't even begin to imagine, can I, what that would feel like? I don't know. All, we're faced with dilemmas that we ought to give up and we don't give up. How many things do we do that to get to that feeling of like, I know it's not right, but I can't stop, but I want to.
Right. Right. Yes. And that neither here nor there type of position
Mm,
is, of course, really interesting, uh,
mm-hmm.
given what we discussed in the last chapter with the kid's statement about Sproul. What's wrong with you is all the way through wrong with you,
All the way through.
or again, like again, jumping ahead to much, much later in the novel, where the judge essentially accuses the kid of, standing in witness against himself. There's a flaw in the fabric of his being. So
Mm,
he's the kid, or, the kid is a genocidal agent but nonetheless he harbors some corner of clemency for the heathen. So he's neither here nor there in a
mm,
lot of ways. And it's actually really, really cool because in the master's house, you know, the neither here nor there sort of kinder, gentler slaveholder is trying to, force Toadvine to be less physically violent. And
Mm-hmm.
so Toadvine finds this utterly annoying, and he's complaining to another overseer, to his, his buddy, whose
Yeah.
I think name is Colonel Price. And Colonel Price like agrees with Toadvine, and in one passage, I think that's very significant to Blood Meridian. Colonel Price says, "There is one thing that'll never do, one thing never do, and that is to let employers interfere too much in our business."
Mm.
And then he says, "My notion is let me be head or tail or nothing."
Right.
Right? So let me be one thing or the other, but don't make me be neither here nor there, right? Which
Mm.
is what Mildmay is kind of forcing on Toadvine in this sort of moment of I don't know if it's a moment of crisis of conscience. I myself I kind of I do sort of want to I would link the sadism
Mm.
like and again remember that Brass Teeth is called a pervert.
Yes.
And one of the like if we're going to be talking about perversions in like a medical or a psychoanalytic sense, maybe the two most familiar perversions are sadism and masochism.
Mm-hmm.
So on the one hand, Toadvine is just a sadist, right? He I don't know, takes, there's that kind of sexual or sexualized image of him readying his whip, and it's almost like an image of masturbation.
Right.
And so he gets off on torturing
Yeah.
people. Mildmay, interestingly, gets off on feeling guilty about having to torture people. So
Uh,
there's a kind of, like there's a kind of masochism
mm,
to this neither here nor there sort of
mm,
position. And if we want to go down, if we want to frame this in sort of terms of Afro-pessimism, both the sadism against black bodies and is
mm,
sort of like the the correspondent to that is the masochism of you know the white torturer.
mm-hmm.
As so again, like, so it's kind of interesting that we have these themes in this novel, The Master's House, about let me be one thing or the other, but also this kind of like weird, probably American um, duality or dichotomy where you want to be good, but you also want to get your rocks off torturing
Right.
somebody who's absolutely helpless.
Well, that's interesting because it's reminding me of Octavia Pa has one of the most beautiful paragraphs about libertarianism. And the crime of it is to be neither here nor there. And yet you want to pursue your own personal pleasures, but you're not going to stand up for anything else in general. Oh no, everybody should do their own. So I can't find it. I've got it somewhere, but I've thought about bringing it on to one of our episodes because it's such a good one. But that just triggered me right now about neither here nor there. Oh, libertarianism. Um, Yeah. So we've got in this thing, we have them in jail. They wake up. It's a beautiful description of how they wake up in the morning in jail and what they have to do. Is they get dragged out to clean up shit with their bare hands, maybe
I
from
wouldn't call that beautiful.
no,
I'm
it's
just
not. It's
kidding.
grotesque. It's grotesque. So yeah,
Yeah.
again, we have another chapter that's going into that grotesquerie, which could be like Barack and all these the what you described in your opening of the Glanton gang has that folding, has that bizarre bringing together of incongruous ideas to us as readers. But we have them in jail now, and it seems pretty destitute. It does not look good for them. Um,
They become like Baldric on that Rowan
yes,
Atkinson
I do.
Blackadder
Of
series.
course.
Baldric was like a shit shoveler, and he's like, my
Yes.
dad was a shit shoveler, my granddad was a
Yes.
shit shoveler.
Yes. Yeah.
So that, yeah, they're forced to clean up the dung of the streets with their bare
Yes.
hands. Yeah, it's pretty
Yes.
disgusting.
And then on the nice side, it is really well described. They get to sit outside in the sun or find shade and kind of watch the street. And there is a lot of energy of girls and women, and they get to watch all the people in this town who it's kind of interesting how they intermingle on the street, if you think about it. Yeah, I can't imagine us doing it now, except when you're driving in the States, every now and then you'll see a cleaning crew at the side of the highway, and they're usually prisoners. Oh, but they're being cared for.
But yeah, like these are all American mercenaries, like
Yes.
sort of fortune seekers. And this is probably very historically accurate that, there were sort of flows of prisoners, American prisoners who were seeking their fortune or otherwise, engaged in hunting activities that weren't endorsed by civic authorities or stuff like that. So it's really interesting that there's also this kind of camaraderie angle too, right? Like the kid is and Toadvine, they're kind of glad to see each other, and as soon as they
Yeah.
realize, oh, it's that guy, they stick together, right? And
Yeah.
so, and of course, they meet the veteran, you know, Granny Rat. I get is the veteran and Granny Rat, they're the
Correct. They're
same,
the
right?
same
Yeah, that's.
person. And if we're wrong, oops, correct us. No, I mean I'm very
No, I'm
sure
pretty
Granny.
sure. Yeah.
Yeah, they're the same. Great name, Granny Rat. What is that about? Um, and they talk about being in jail, and they're talking about brass teeth. They're hanging out with Granny Rat, and he starts. I guess Toadvine says he's glad he wasn't in the state penitentiary, and they talk about that. And the state penitentiary would have been Huntsville, I believe, which is a fun thing that lines up with No Country for Old Men. Just a
I see.
subtle
Yeah.
little thing. I just enjoyed that. Um, and Granny Rat starts talking about old pilgrims down one of the trails, um, different war stories he's had. And these kids, what is he? Maybe 25 and they're 16 and 18. I mean, maybe Toadvine's 24. Maybe
Yeah.
Granny Rat would be 25 or something. Because I mean, he'd have to be young enough to be in the Mexican American War, and yet old enough to have gone through it. And there's the kid. They're kind of teaming up, and they kind of seem to look up to him.
Yeah. So yeah. I at uh, the veteran, and it's interesting. It must demand our attention in some way. The veteran's story about he'd been at Mir, where they'd fought until the drain tiles and the gutters and the spouts from the azoteas ran with blood by the gallon, et cetera, et cetera. Because Mir is, I hope I'm pronouncing that right.
I believe you.
It is it's mentioned in the chapter subheadings, right? Like that.
Yes.
So, that must mean something that he put that in, Mir rather than, the veteran story, something like that, but it's Mir
Mm-hmm.
as the chapter subheading. So
Right. Right.
so
And
that enjoined us to do some research about what was that all about, what
correct.
happened at Mir, and I guess it was an expedition in November 1842 by a Texian militia against Mexican border settlement. So this was at a time when Texas was not yet part of America, but calling on America for aid against
Mm,
Mexico in its bid for independence. So Mir was a kind of really poorly designed attempt against a Mexican settlement, in which the Americans brutally lost.
mm,
And you know, we learned through our research that so a whole bunch of, if you weren't killed as an American, if you weren't killed in this like ill, starred expedition, you were taken prisoner.
mhm.
And you know, on March the 24th, I'm just sort of looking
Yeah.
at my notes. The Mir prisoners were escorted to Salado, where they learned that there was an order because the prisons were overflowing, so
Mm,
they couldn't actually capacity wise couldn't handle the amount of prisoners. So there was an order demanding the death of each 10th man. And how did they determine each 10th man, or what they did, what the Mexican authorities did to figure out who they would kill and who they would put in jail. they got they had a big sack of beans, 157 white beans and 17 black beans or something like that
Mhm.
were placed in an earthen jar. And then the prisoners were lined up and made to draw one bean each. The black one um, signifying death to the men who drew them.
Mhm.
And so if you drew a white bean, I guess you were off to prison. If you
Mhm.
drew a black bean, you were summarily executed. So there's this, you know, and we've talked about this.
Yeah.
I think this is absolutely, super interesting and deeply significant because of, again, the judge's philosophy of war, which he'll be espousing much later in
Yeah.
the
Right.
novel, and where he kind of boils war down to its like absurd minimum of a
Mhm.
game of Russian roulette, right?
Right.
And for the judge like to you know there's a weird kind of selection process. He kind of personifies or hypostasizes history as the historical absolute, and like if you are selected, that means history looks fondly upon you, and if you are not, then you are never meant to be anyways. So he
Yes.
had, it's this mere expedition, really brief mention,
Yeah.
is in a very suppressed, allegorical or indirect way, relates already to what's going to be kind of the judge's perverse philosophy
Well,
of war.
definitely. And the judge talks about a card game where they bet on their lives at one point later in the novel,
That's right.
which would go into Russian roulette. And of course, we've got again No Country for Old Men in the future. I've always said that Anton is the response to people being too glorifying the judge, that he had to make another character that was just as bad and also has an interesting relationship with emotions.
So you're saying that McCarthy, like Dr. Frankenstein, was horrified at his creation
And the
being Holden.
beautification. Yes,
Right, yes.
the
Yes.
beautification and beholdenness of Holden. He definitely had to go, I thought I wrote about evil. I've got to write about evil again. I thought I made what does he call the judge in his notes? The Gestalt monster in at the Whitcliffe. It's been
Right, right, right.
reshared with many people's papers. And so he had to make a new Gestalt monster with Anton Sugar, I suppose. Which, I have notes on that of why they're like that too. But yeah, no, it's so interesting that bean game and that chance. And of course, I think there's more than that with chance and our fate in McCarthy's world, in his universe anyway. But it's pretty cool that comes up with that weird memory when you find that out. So I think that could tell us Granny Rat has some injury, but he also must have post-traumatic stress disorder. And maybe he is more like 30 now that you tell me 1942. He could be more like 30 years old,
Yeah.
but which would be an older, wiser guy to those two young men. I mean,
Yeah, so
Toadvine could be
he
24.
survived.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. He survived Mir, so I guess
Mm-hmm.
he drew a white bean, right?
Uh-huh.
And so he was again, like it's interesting that he returns to Mexico to claim some woman. Well, that's how it seems to be put. Like I think it's something like dark-eyed love,
It is.
right?
Yeah, he lost
But
a dark eyed love.
but what it like talking about post-traumatic stress disorder, it's like a gambling thing, right? Like you had this 50-50 chance of surviving, and you survived, and that's like
Then go back to it.
that's a kind of intense moment of experience separated from all other experiences. Benjamin would call this an Erlebnis moment,
Mm-hmm.
just an isolated incident. And actually, Benjamin does relate Erlebnis, or isolated moment or experience, to gambling. Um,
Mm.
so maybe like the dark-eyed love is just like, his gambling with life and death or something like that, like it
Right.
may it may not actually be literal is what
It
I'm
may
saying.
not be. It could be like the dark lady in the sonnets. It could be, yeah, this dark-eyed lady is mysterious Fortuna. You're right. It could be. Of course, we also know in Vietnam when the guys came back and they did not feel like they fit into culture. They felt alienated or they were traumatized or both. They often signed up again because having a company of brothers was better than, you know, the odds at home of getting a job. And we know that motorcycle culture really expanded with the Vietnam vets creating their own culture and some gang warfare among those motorcycle gangs back in the day um, after Vietnam, but definitely re-signing up again because at least they knew what their odds were. At least they knew that they had a chance. That's
And
pretty sad.
I mean, they're trained to be killers, right? They're trained to be as aggressive as possible, maximizing their aggression, and and when you return to a quote unquote civil society or whatever, and everything you've done has been to release or channel your aggression. Yeah, I guess.
Yeah. Well, there's theories out there that the rise in serial killers, they thought maybe some of the fathers of these serial killers were either traumatized from Second World War or Vietnam. And whatever trauma they brought back with them, they're not necessarily saying that those people tortured their kids, although torture is part of being a serial killer's profile, that they did have. That is one of their profiles. But, that they were kids of vets and that war came home and, was malignant in the children. So, we definitely know that there's something like that. But Granny Rat seems pretty good. He's a good storyteller.
And
For,
he will like he's pretty clever too, right?
yeah,
Because he basically like agrees, to be part of Toadvine's gang of well, let's join these guys to get out of prison. And he
yeah.
agrees to that, but he immediately tries to abandon abandon the Glanton gang, or fairly soon
Fairly
thereafter,
soon
right?
after in the next, yeah, yeah. Yeah, well, maybe he just wanted to get out of jail. We don't know why he's in jail. We know why the two guys are in jail. Um, just I guess they're war criminals, right? Um,
Well,
while they're
yeah,
sitting in the street. Oh, go ahead.
I don't know why the kid is in jail, actually. I
Right.
mean, he's just picked up and arrested.
Mm,
I don't know if those who arrested the kid knew that he was part. Well, they must have, because they bring him before the pale face severed head of
of Captain
Captain White,
White.
right?
Yeah, that is part of it. So I guess he's in it for that, for
Yeah.
for their mercenary work. What else about this chapter? Again, now you had the dark-eyed love, and we definitely have eyes. Eyes are part of this chapter, and watching is part of this chapter because they can't really do much. They're in prison, so they're watching the street. They watch Brass Teeth, their torturer, and they're definitely in the world of observation. And eye motif does come up at least 5 times in the short chapter. Um, and they listen to a story, which is kind of like watching too, because Granny Rat recalls some of his interesting war stories. There's a cortege. There's a coach that comes in here, and it's got an eye painted on the side of it with stripes coming out, and it enters the scene with a bell ringing, which made me think of warding off evil. A bell is a magic procedure to ward off evil, and then the eye is too. But is there some company, or was that a government funeral, or why is there an eye on that? I can't figure that out.
It might be, yeah, I don't really know. It may be like some kind of Catholic icon or like image,
Maybe.
or like
Yeah.
something, because it is a religious coach, right? It seems to be that someone is dying, who is worthy of absolution or something like that, and so this coach is going to the um, yeah, it says, it had an eye painted on the side, that is the Gita, or no, sorry, the coach, and four mules to draw it, taking the host to some soul. So
Hmm.
and then a priest is tottering behind, carrying an image or whatever. But the image is just a kind of a it would have been like a sort of three-dimensional box-like thing, and if you open it up, there would be probably a little statue of a particularly important saint.
Mm-hmm.
And you open this box up and you pray,
Mm.
with it open, and the saint will somehow lend its beneficence to whoever's being prayed over or something like that.
I guess it's like bringing a mini altar to a deathbed.
Yes, yeah,
Yes. And I love that diorama feeling of it too. Again, there's a story within a story,
that's
right?
right. Yeah. So
Um,
the image that I have seen
yes.
of the kind that I'm describing
Yes.
is actually from a film, one of my favorite films. I think it's from 1972. It's Louis Buñuel's The Phantom of Liberty.
Mm,
Um, yes, and exactly as you said, there's a moment where a priest praying for a woman's sick father brings in an image of Saint Joseph and opens it up. And indeed, it's kind of like they're painted panels,
mhm,
like a diptych of two
mhm,
panels. And then inside, in a kind of recess, would have been the statue of Saint Joseph or
mm,
something like that.
mhm. Yeah, that's pretty cool. Um, and it also you think about that must have been a pretty revered person to have that treatment. They were either wealthy or, like you said, to the church, high up in the church. And to think about these boys looking at that and their rough life, I wonder if they ever thought we're not going to be having a funeral like that. And they certainly don't.
They were too busy plotting how to take out old brass teeth, right?
Correct.
The
There's a
very first thing Toadvine says, he kind of looks at the kid, and they watched the overseer covertly as he passed, his hands
correct.
clasped behind his back. The kid spat, right? Like,
Hmm.
and then Toadvine's like, I seen him first. And so once again, like Toadvine is kind of inviting the kid um, to violence,
Hmm.
right? Just as he did in in the very first meeting, they fought each other,
That's
and
right.
then they became fast friends. And but then Toadvine sort of, solicited the kid to burn down this hotel and kill the whole
Right.
city.
Right. And the watching, they also watch two dogs mating, copulating.
Right?
Two
Yeah, that's
dogs.
quite
And then
hilarious.
it's quite hilarious. And then later you see the kid still watching the dogs. Everything's going on, but the kid's still watching the dogs, probably because he's a teenager, right? It reminds you he's still a teenager. This is still like, oh, interesting
Or hilarious.
or hilarious. In the memory of Granny Rat, he talks about a hearse. See by its he's in a there's a field of a war and he sees this cart. See by its lantern the dead cart moving among them like a hearse from limbo. And then we have that cortege again in the town. So that's another beautiful layer upon layer of a storytelling and then in real life.
Using a simile.
Is that a simile
Uh,
again? Yes. Oh, yes. Used like a limbo, like a hearse from
like
limbo.
like a hearse from limbo, which is like,
Right.
again, it's that's not a concrete thing, right? What limbo is just like a layer of Dante's hell where the
Yeah.
virtuous unsaved live, and
Mhm.
their only pain is they're not able to gaze directly upon God or something like that.
Hmm.
But
And
a hearse from limbo, yeah,
yeah, I
it's like
might add that the
total
beans.
abstraction.
I might add that when you get the white bean, that you're in limbo in prison. Prison is like a weird societal limbo too. You can't live, but you're alive.
Yeah, and the kid at this moment is in a kind of limbo, and he's about to be released, and
Yes.
but he's not going to a better place. He's going to a much, much worse place.
But that's the thing again. Is it better than prison?
Well, I
Right?
think I think you would say yes, right?
I
And
think
it
he
is,
would.
may I don't want to jump too much
No,
ahead, but
no.
the fact that they're in prison and the way that the novel ends with this reference to law French, this old medieval
Mm.
weird aspect of English law, that
Right. That we
that's kind of interesting
Well,
too.
that's interesting too because, I still want to get to, we've got a lot of things we could talk about today, but it does
Yes.
in the headers, there is the French quote saying, and then they set off to the country. And you have to wonder, what does country mean in this novel? I do. For me, what is country? It means so many different things to different people. It could mean land, it could mean social, it could mean um, a town, it could mean it probably doesn't it could mean wilderness or it could mean countryside. And at the very end of the novel, of course, we find out that they set off. So at one point, we should talk about the other thing that they watch is they watch what you read, the Glanton gang coming into
I'm
town.
glad you mentioned that. Yeah.
Yes. So they're sitting there and they watch it, and Toadvine goes, "Okay, we're out of here. I see our freedom, right? I see how we're going to get out of here." And I love it because he tells them like we're the three best
Yeah,
scalpers in the
that's
world.
right.
I'm like, what's this based
Again,
on?
sort of like, lying for advantage, right? Just like the kid lied to
Yes.
Captain White to get for his own advantage.
To be another damn fool out in the road.
But that description, we should definitely we should talk about that. Like, first of all, to me, rhetorically, it's absolutely beautiful. Like we
Yes.
have this repetition, almost like if it was poetry, it would be anaphora, right? The repetition of something in the initial position. So
Mm,
we have a whole bunch of sentences that start with they saw, they
yes.
saw, they saw, and they saw, So we have this we have the repetition of this phrase, which, as you point out, like indicates the importance of the visual in this chapter.
Hmm.
We have, and the description of the Glanton gang, uses, polysyndeton again, this and, right? It's like the description of the Glanton gang, a pack of vicious looking humans, stitched up with thews and armed with weapons and bowie knives and short two-barreled rifles and their horses, and this polysyndeton, this repetition of phrases connected by this conjunction and this is a figure of amplification. So it's kind of like, in a way you could look at it in a bunch of different ways, I guess. But it's a figure of amplification, so it's showing the sublimity of the Glanton gang, or the negative sublimity, because they look like cannibals and they look awful and horrible and they're actually kind of terrifying, right?
Yeah.
But like this and the last time we had a kind of extended version of this was at the end of chapter 4 with the description of the Comanche attack, right? So it's something overwhelming.
Hmm.
It's like the idea of the mathematical sublime or something like that in Kant's aesthetics.
Most
You know, it's
definitely.
it and it could also still, relate to ideas of trauma, right? Because if you're traumatized, that kind of means something happened that was overwhelming in the moment and that you couldn't process fully.
Oh
So
yeah.
that,
When I have something bad happen to me, sometimes Stag, something will happen at work or somebody will say something on the street or something. Go, oh, something bad happened. He goes, what was it? I went, I don't know. I have to tell you later. I literally protect myself and put it in a box. Yeah.
yeah.
Then I tell him and I'm like, oh, it's way worse than I thought it was. I have perceptual problems sometimes. Comprehension of human expressions, which reminds me, I do want to kind of just, I hope this is part of relating to what we're saying. I'm just looking for where we see the judge, and if you see it, let me know and
Oh yeah.
read it.
Well, it's
You
it's
want to read it?
literally it's right after the passage that we are talking about and that we
Okay.
read in the opening. So
Do you want to?
it's
Do you
on
want
my page 83. Yeah, so that's also really interesting because McCarthy gives a more or less a paragraph description of the Glanton gang
to?
in
Yeah.
general,
Yes.
and then saves the next paragraph
Yeah.
for a description of the judge. And so also kind of just in that formal separation, well, here we need a separate paragraph for the judge,
You're
to
right.
begin
You're
with.
right. I do see it here.
Yeah.
The
You,
following. Oh, is it the following day? Is that would be the beginning
no,
of it?
no, no, it's foremost among them.
Foremost among them, outsized and childlike with his naked face, rode the judge. His cheeks were ruddy, and he was smiling and bowing to the ladies and drifting his filthy hat. Oh, doffing his filthy hat. I'm having trouble seeing because it's too dark in here. The enormous dome of his head when he bared it was blinding white and perfectly circumscribed about so that it looked like to have been painted. He and the
Interesting.
Yeah, isn't it? It blew my mind. He and the reeking horde of rabble and him passed on through the stunned streets and hove up before the governor's palace, where their leader, a small black-haired man, clapped for entrance by kicking at the oaken doors with his boot. The doors were opened forthwith, and they rode in all, and the doors were closed again.
Amazing. And so, yeah, so it begins with a judge and ends with a very brief description without naming him of Glanton.
Yes, yes, you're right. Isn't that fascinating? And to me, the judge has an inversion on his dome because his hat, when he takes it off, he's got the inversion of a scalping. It's like his white dome is exactly where all the scalping would happen, right? It sounds so vulnerable when you see it that way. The other part that always gets me is
And that
um
image will return at the very end when the judge is dancing under,
that's right.
the lights of the bar
That's
in
right.
Griffin, and it's called a dome as well, I think,
Yes,
if
I
I
think you're
remember.
right. And that could send us on a rabbit hole too, just of the image of a dome. Right? I love this part too. The following day, the judge, in the company of others, stood in the street, smoking a cigar and rocking back on his heels. He wore a pair of good kid-skin boots, and he was studying the prisoners where they knelt at the gutter, clutching up the filth with their bare hands. The kid was watching the judge. When the judge's eyes fell upon him, he took the cigar out from between his teeth and smiled, or he seemed to smile. Then he put the cigar between his teeth again. Oh, that's so creepy. Because, for me, and I probably told you this
Yes.
story
Yeah.
before, is I have the problem I have perceiving emotions sometimes. And I watched Survivor for all the years. It helped me understand it, reading people's faces. But one time my husband and I were on a road trip and we kept seeing people on bicycles, doing marathon bike rides. And I said, he goes, "Oh, this must be hell in this heat. This is horrible." I kept saying, "Why are you being so negative? Maybe they love it." And one day we're in British Columbia and we're going up a mountain and these group of bikes come up over the other side of the mountain. I go, "Look, see, they're smiling." And my husband goes, "Candy, they're grimacing." So that face of the judge, you just know that will be classic. If they film that in the movie, that has to be a classic scene, right?
Oh yeah, and like I guess in the animal kingdom,
Oh,
baring your teeth or smiling, right? That's kind of aggression. It's not it's like so it's very ambiguous, right? It's like
yes,
welcoming, I
yes.
recognize you, but it's also like here are my teeth. And the other creepy thing of the passage that you read is that he wore kid skin boots, and so of course our protagonist is named the Kid. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Even right before that, we have
Mm-hmm.
this awesome simile, the whole like a visitation from some heathen land where they and others like them fed on human flesh. So,
Mm-hmm.
we have this likening of the Glanton gang to the cannibals or
Yes,
to cannibals, which
yes.
again brings us back to the Karankawa's,
Mhm.
description of
Correct.
like, their fabled
Right.
taste for human flesh, but it also maybe even brings us back to the epigraph and, the Australopithecine skull with its scalp marks that,
Correct. Uma son,
anthropologists
the
might
Uma
might
son. Yes, yes.
might
Yeah, you're
think
right.
that, that scalping was done for perhaps cannibalistic purposes. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. You're right.
So it's a very menacing introduction to the Glanton gang.
Yeah, it really is. It really is. Yikes. Um,
We do get a lot of polysyndeton too at the end of the chapter, with that kind of final paragraph. Um,
right.
I don't know if we are already ready to get there. 3 days later, they rode out single file through the streets with the governor and his party. The governor on a pale gray stallion, and the killers on their small war ponies, smiling and bowing, and the lovely dark-skinned girls throwing flowers from the windows, and some blowing kisses, and small boys running alongside, and old men waving their hats and crying out huzzas, and Toadvine and the Kid and the veteran bringing up the rear.
Totally.
Veteran, like it's just and. So
Yes.
again, another kind of McCarthy loves Polly Syndeton as a
Yeah.
figure of speech.
Yeah. I guess it just, you're right. It does speak to abundance and to overwhelming your mind because you want to start to count. what how many things are you describing there for sure? I
Well,
love
it's sort of like you're looking at a scene, that is so complex you have to like
yeah,
gather all the elements one by one. It's,
yes,
it is a painting,
yes.
and I think you've probably said this before, but painting is also, there is time in painting, right? And
Mhm.
even in the viewing of a painting, it takes time and you have
Right.
to,
Right. Well, one painting is a frame of time. It's one still second or nanosecond of time. It's frozen there, right? And film, 24 frames per second. I mean, all of artwork has that, and you're right, how long it takes you to look at it would also add to time. And then time factoring in art. That's another day too. Um, do you do you see compulsion coming up in in this gambling thing or with them running out? How do you see them like, I guess it's just vulnerable. They're so glad to be free from the jail that there's really no, you know, way for
Yeah,
them to really negotiate it other than that.
so yeah, like I mean, it is that's, like this last kind of this phrase from French law, et
Hmm.
aseo se met en la paix,
Right.
which is a kind of an old French way of adapting a kind of a Roman law called ponere se super patriam in Latin, which is
Mhm.
basically like trial by jury. And so remember
Ah,
there
right. I
there
forgot you said that.
so
Right.
they in some ways the kid, and Toadvine and Granny Rat, they are gambling
Hmm.
on this trial by jury, right?
Yes.
Because what else is going to happen to them in the prison? They
Oh,
don't know. They may rot there for the rest of their lives. Like
right.
that just may be the place where they wither and die. Like, but also over decades, like so.
Yes.
This is a gamble, to head out with the Glanton gang,
And
and
you
so
reminded me, oh, go, keep going.
yeah, just this I really want to research this more, but this idea from law French that like trial by jury is it's like a different way to determine the proof of a case, right? Whether you're
Right.
guilty or innocent. Older ways may have included an ordeal, like
Hmm.
trial
Hmm.
by fire, like literally, like God will prove your
Hmm.
innocence if you
Hmm.
survive, right? And we know this like from all the witch trials, right? Like if you
Right.
survive being set in a fire, then you're innocent.
That's right. Well, you reminded me too. We've heard the story of Mir, and if we know about the Mir and the beans, that is not odds I like. I'd rather have a trial by jury. So,
That's
in
right.
a weird way, it shows the kind of, I wouldn't want to say it's an evolution of justice, but it's the spectrum of justice. We're and we've got jail here. So we are the topic could be justice in this as well. It could be underlying this chapter. And you've got the battle, you've got the war, and you've got gambling. And the other thing we know is that McCarthy has spent time with gamblers. He had some kind of interest and fascination with gambling because he was friends with his friend Betty, who was in that Meeting McCarthy recollection by Gary Wallace. And it sounds like he certainly was hanging out with poker players, whether or not he was playing, but he may have really been concerned with that game of chance, which is a great philosophical way to look at the world. And the
And
judge
remember,
cares about it.
yeah, we're gonna get to it for sure. Like,
Yeah.
or it's in a chapter to come where something like those undertaking, totally risky enterprises often fall back on thinking about things like fate,
Yes.
and yeah.
Yes. Yes. So
And
that's
I did want to point like what you said about the idea of country, like, and
mm-hmm.
all of its kind of different
Mm-hmm.
resonances.
Mm-hmm.
So this phrase from La French, um, it does kind of make country mean the social, as you said.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm reading from a kind of a little bit of a little bit on this law French particular thing, and so, like most people who were tried uh, at a certain point were brought forward after they had been named by the presenting jury and asked how they pleaded. Virtually all pleaded not guilty and put themselves on the country, and that's the phrase, right? Put themselves on the country,
Mm-hmm.
which means trial by jury.
Mm-hmm.
And, often it was the case that you could have been, totally obviously guilty of something, but if the jury was sympathetic to you, that means you would definitely most likely get off, right? So it was a gamble to put yourself on the country and
Mm-hmm.
put yourself before a panel of your peers or whatever as a jury.
Mm-hmm.
So, even putting yourself on the country is a gamble.
Yeah. And again, back to Vietnam, I think that soldiers said in country, referring to being in Vietnam. I don't know. I do screw that up. I don't know if it's up. It's not up country, but I think it's in country. I think that was another phrase for being in Vietnam or in war. So
Right, right, yeah.
kind of a weird thing. I love how I said before, Toadvine, he's like thinking about what they're going to do. They're going to take these chances. I told them we were three of the best.
Yeah.
And then 3 days later, they rode out in single file. I just
Ah.
love that because of that weird, there's two threes and then single file, and they took the road up country. I just think it's a pretty great ending to that
And
chapter.
hey, this is a chapter with three sections too.
Yes. Yeah. And a book with 3 sections,
And a book with three sections. Yeah. So we're
as we
talking
started out.
about triptychs within triptychs.
Yes. Yes. Chiasmas within chiasm. Um, definitely, definitely. What else do I like about this chapter? Ugh.
Well, like you said, there's a lot of emphasis on the visual.
hmm
Um, when we have mention of an image, like images, visuality, you know, I think if I'm understanding like where you're coming from, with memory and the importance of
hmm
memory in the kind of esoteric tradition
hmm
that you're trying to elaborate. The more horrific an image was, the more that it could elicit a powerful emotion, the more likely it would be remembered. So,
Correct.
like all of these medieval psychologists and their bestiaries, right? They loved painting the most grotesque
Oh,
images
yeah.
because those helped you remember something.
Yes, yes. And at the same time, I believe they're related to satire might not be the right word, but there is like a tragic comedy slash satire, a social that they are social criticism. So grotesquerie does show up in social criticism. And I suppose you could include Gulliver's Travels for one of those because he's always meeting all the, unusual people, right? Which was setting him out as a satire for where he was. Also, a great anthropologist beginning perspective in that novel. Um,
Except there's too many semicolons and
too many
before.
semicolons for us, yes, for us McCarthy fans.
I think
That is
McCarthy said
hilarious.
something about Jonathan Swift and
Did
there
he
was too many
really?
semicolons. Yeah.
Oh shit, that's so funny. Oh, I had no idea. Yeah, so novelty, basically. Yeah, you're going to have this spectacle. I mean, in the last two chapters, 5 and 6, there were those decadent descriptions of the street life. And I would say that they could have been considered you could look at them as elitist because we treat food differently now and we treat, you know, in North America, we want everything standardized and clean and a certain level of food treatment and that we used to have Kensington Market in Toronto and they closed down the live animals. PETA got involved. It was no goats hanging in windows. But when I first got there, it was just right out of Blood Meridian in Toronto. It was like, goats and flies and everything. And in other cultures, they don't see
Wet
that.
markets.
Wet markets, they don't see that as a hazard. Like we're just so snot. And it is a form of elitism. you know, because a lot of those treatments of food have been done for thousands of years and people are probably fine. Yeah, so novelty is something I'm pretty interested in, and I've read a number of papers on it. There's a lot of research on surprise and novelty right now, and I do relate it to one, to learning, and two, to distributed cognition. And they found that um, these researchers have found that both novelty enhances memory and also prevents it. So you could see with trauma, something so novel could be part of post-traumatic stress disorder. And amnesia is a response to trauma sometimes too. However, it also goes the opposite way, and we can learn a lot about the mind by these studies of novelty. And certainly you look at the Oprah consciousness and New Ageism or psychedelic culture, and they call that a paradigm shift or an aha moment when you have like, oh my God, you know, that comes up. But certainly Blood Meridian seems to be in that decadent tradition that, I mean, Baroque is decadent. The visual arts in Baroque are really decadent. Maybe not so decadent in Deleuze and Benjamin's reaction to it or their theories, but definitely in the art world, those are really decadent visuals.
Too theatrical.
Too theatrical, yes.
Well, yeah, like on the question of, the negative impact of novelty as being sort of anti-memory,
Hmm.
or it obstructs memory formation.
Hmm.
That actually to me goes back to, so like Benjamin was very interested in what experience is, um, and so he has this kind of distinction between Erlebnis, which is, I kind of
Hmm.
mentioned this before,
Yeah,
an
you did.
isolated experience, and then
Yes.
Erfahrung, which is like long experience.
Mm.
So think about the gambler at the slot machine, right? There's an isolated experience of like pulling the lever, seeing the results, and then you have to do that all over again. And there's no connection between the one lever pull and the next, right? It's
Mhm.
like this repetition of the exact same thing. Or think of like working in a factory where you have to, you just, you're on the assembly line, you do your one thing, right?
Mhm.
And it's just like isolated moment, isolated moment, isolated moment, and there's no ability to create a long experience, which would be the foundation of memory.
Right.
So on the one hand, we have this, I think, tension in novelty, right? And also in Blood Meridian, where every sentence is somehow like so outrageous, or like everything else falls away, and then you have to go to the next sentence, and that's totally cool for totally different reasons. Or so we have like on the one hand, our own trauma in reading this novel, like sentence after sentence, and we can't combine them all, because it's too mathematically sublime. But at the same time, this is a congealment, the novel that is, of long experience. This, took 7 years to write, probably longer gestation than that.
Mhm.
So much research went into it. He had to research what happened at Mir and just like barely alludes to it, and but
Mhm.
we have this, to me, like when you talk about distributed cognition, like the book is cognition that has been distributed. So like
Absolutely.
it is a congealment of cognition as
Absolutely.
well. And so this has been making me think about, like on the one hand, a book is like a congealment of long experience on the part of the author, but
Mhm.
then on the part of the type of reader that we are with this book, where we just go back to it over and over and over
Mhm.
again, um, then we have our own, our own cognition has also been distributed into the book.
Definitely.
And
Absolutely. That's so true. And, and that's what, because it's got so much complexity in it, sometimes it is difficult to remember things. With the archaic words, it creates a regenerative novel that will always bring you surprises. It would not be easy to memorize this book, I don't think. It like Fahrenheit 451 or whatever. I don't think we could memorize it, but we certainly could with the kind of ways we've looked at the structure. Many times people thought there wasn't very much structure in Blood Meridian, but there is. But it is It is incantatory, so it's difficult.
Yeah.
Yeah. I want to revisit again about distributed cognition, just to repeat. And Wheeler and Clark kind of took this. Distributed cognition came about by Edwin Arnold, who wrote a book, Cognition in the Wild. And
Edwin Arnold?
no,
Edwin
not
Arnold?
Edwin, Edwin Hutchins. Sorry, thank you. See, I got
Chip
my
Arnold.
Chip Arnold, but Edwin Hutchins. Thank you. Jim Morrison. No, um, see, we talk about psychedelia, I get all messed up. Ed Hutchins, and he wrote about it in a naval setting, of a ship, and he wrote about how all their tools, all their procedures, all their protocols mirrored back and forth between the the apparatus and the environment they were at.
Right.
But it can
Yeah.
also go into, storytelling. Into a woman wrote, Evelyn Tribble, a professor in Australia, wrote Cognition in the Globe, inspired by Hutchins' work with this thing. And she took it that even actors in Shakespeare's time, the way they memorize so many complex characters, like there's a lot of dialogue in Shakespeare. It's quite overwhelming. I don't know if there's anything else quite like it in contemporary movies. And they would use prompts, whether it was Robert Flood's stage
Mm.
design,
Hmm.
where part of the stage design reminded you of um, your lines and their gestures. And even they would have things that would prompt. One line would prompt you with a cue for your line, the way he wrote. And they just practice that kind of triggering all the time. And they may or may not have known it. They may or may not have known it. It's like distributed cognition happens whether or not we know about it. There is a lineage, like I say, in Illuminati, or in Hermetic tradition, where you are trained and you're aware of it. But you can still have it without knowing you're doing it. It's possible Blood Meridian was written naively riffing on Anima Mundi and Emerald Tablet and Hermeticism and astrology and tarot. I don't think so. But it's completely possible it could have it in there. I mean, Jay-Z and Beyonce think they're Illuminati and they put the icons in their videos, right? And they get the Louvre to themselves.
Are they Illuminati?
No, but they're Illuminati adjacent. They've had some education to what it might be in terms of image making, right? And lyricism, but they're not Illuminati. There's very few people. David Cronenberg probably is. Cormac McCarthy probably was. But he may not have been initiated. He just may have really understood the concept through art history, because it is an art history. The funny part is, most of the artists I know don't know anything about this. Nothing. In fact, my good friend Eugene, who he's like, "Are you mean to tell me you're embedding like mysterious numbers and stuff in your thing?" And I said, "Well, I wouldn't tell you if I was." But yes, there is a secret history of art, but it doesn't mean that if you don't get tapped into it, you're not necessarily going to notice it and realize that it's in lots of artwork. So distributed cognition came about probably late 90s, I think Hutchins wrote his thing. But what he tapped into was something that was already existing in artifacts. He does not link it. Just like Santa Fe Institute, when they quote that McCarthy, they look for science embedded and metaphors in his work all the time. They said that in 2017. They didn't say, my issue isn't to prove that McCarthy is doing this. My issue is to prove that he's part of a lineage. Right? I know there's science and numbers in McCarthy. And now in 2017, David Krakauer confirmed it. So yay, I win. I was right all the time. But my real challenge wasn't proving that. It was proving that there's a lineage.
You have been selected by the historical absolute. You chose the white bean.
You chose the right bean. I know. Yeah. Uh, it's been many years arguing about this. It's called method of loci. And, to have it in a novel is pretty tricky. But when we do think about Fahrenheit 451, there's a kind of a weird thing that he was doing with that book, was he was tapping into the idea that we memorize books, we memorize stories. And if we lose the actual artifact, we need to be able to replace that story in an oral tradition. Um, there's that kind of thing. So a memory loci was to put memory into a location, right? Method loci, you're putting it into a location. So in the Renaissance, for example, because it's just so easy, we have a record of it. You might see a philosopher like yourself, JVH, and he has to make a big presentation, and he doesn't want to read from a paper, so he will walk through maybe Notre Dame Cathedral, and he will memorize the building and put his speech into every nook and cranny in that building. So when he has to present, he just has to go back into the Notre Dame Cathedral and recall his speech. Um,
Do you think we do that with the books we read? Like, do you have you put something into chapter five, and so then whenever you go back to chapter five, there it is?
well, no,
Like,
because
is the novel the space in which you distribute your cognition?
yes, thank you for asking. That's a very good question. But what he's distributing isn't what I want to put in there. I believe it's what he wanted to put in there. So there are the numbers are significant, and um I would say it could be a navigational basis. I think a lot of this kind of memory thing is navigational. What's interesting in McCarthy is that, whatever was the science in 70,000 years ago that they were concerned with is what's in their artifacts. And it was the moon, it was the celestial stars. Then you get into the Renaissance, and they've got a lot of different information that they want to memorize in terms of celestial information, right? They were still arguing about whether the sun was the center of the universe or not then, right? Whereas probably the sun was the center of the universe 70,000 years ago. I don't know, we took a bad turn there with the sun.
Mm.
Um,
But
and
what do you mean by navigation? Because I don't
literally,
use blood meridian to figure out where I need, if I've got to go 20 miles west, I'm not going to use blood meridian. Do you mean
right.
it like in a
But
more
perhaps the guys
metaphorical way?
reading, no, I mean, perhaps maybe the characters in the novel might use something like Blood Meridian to navigate. I think that maybe the kid carried the Bible. Apparently he couldn't read, but the editions of the Bible back in the day had lots of photos, had lots of pages. It's entirely possible he could count and use the book to count and to keep track of a calendar in some way.
Or
Um,
he could read, but you know, it, that I found that kind of I mean, he probably can't read. He probably is literally illiterate.
yeah.
But you know, even people who are literate can't read. You know what I mean?
I do know what you mean. And
And we're,
certainly,
we're trying to be literate when we read Blood
right.
Meridian.
Yes. Certainly, you're right. We've
It's a
talked about the
struggle.
kid. The kid can read. He reads in a way that's pre-literate. He reads tracks. He seems to be able to get around. He knows to go west. He knows to use the sun, and we've seen him start to get more and more familiar with the stars. So yes, I would say that art and literature and artifacts have recorded information that could be navigationally useful or could be time, because there is no such thing as time, and we've got to have some way to figure out where we are. There's like the famous guy that went into a cave in the 50s, and his clock got all off, and he
Right.
ended up having 36-hour days instead of 24-hour days because he didn't have anything to keep him on it. And
Weird.
yeah, it's very weird. And we found out that there's, many weird things that happen with that aren't good, without being able to keep track of where time is or where your day uh, begins and starts.
So when I think of navigation or the book as a navigational tool, I do kind of think of that metaphorically because, like this is a great American novel, quote unquote, and I think
Hmm.
McCarthy was like fairly self-consciously trying to produce something like that. So in other words, he's writing a novel for the nation. Um,
Hmm.
and so, when I think of navigation, I think of like how do we socially navigate um, our history? Where do we take this history? What do we do with it? So it's like distributing cognition, like literally through publication and mass reproduction of
You're dead
print,
right.
right?
You're dead right. Navigation is that as well. In fact, when you look at the phrase Jesus is the way, or you look at the phrase Buddha, Tao is the way, and then you look at the um, Santiago pilgrimage,
Compostela? Yeah.
yes, between Spain and France. It's
Hey, Louis Buñuel made a movie about
He
that.
did. I love it. I'm obsessed
It's
with that
so
play.
good, yeah.
I know I'm obsessed with it. I haven't never done it. I really would
The
like that.
Milky Way, yeah.
I would love
My
to do
cut
that.
my cousin has done that at least twice,
Yeah,
maybe
damn it,
three
that's
times.
amazing. Well, Trisha, I'm in Wisconsin at my friend Trisha's house right now, and she's done it too. I'm like, how come we didn't know each other then? And it's rumored to have Saint James at the end of it, I believe, one of Jesus's brothers, maybe, or disciple. See, I'm so bad at
Well,
Christianity.
like James was a brother of, there was a James who was a brother of Christ and like I guess or Jesus
Yeah.
and had like a version of the Christian church. He was like
Okay.
vegetarian, but
Oh,
Paul the Pauline church won out, right? So
yeah.
Christianity,
Okay.
uh,
Well, it
you know,
might be him at the end of it in Spain at the ocean, but it's
it,
called the
but
Way.
it
It's
could
called
be
the
a
Way.
different it could be a different Saint
Yeah.
James.
So in the same way that the Philosopher's Stone and alchemy is to turn lead into gold, it's really a metaphor for changing your spirit into gold. What kind of clay are we made of? Can we mold it or not? Right? Page 4, Blood Meridian.
Yeah.
And so the navigation is also you're absolutely right. It's literal to me in artifacts like the stupa in or time factoring or the Antikythera mechanism, but it's metaphorical, spiritually, and philosophically. What kind of person are we going to be? What kind of a country are we going to be? We're going to go into what do we mean by country? It is social, it is the land. And that is very important. Are we going to have a jury? Are we going to take it by chance? And when you're talking about gambling, the slot machine, and I mentioned a slot machine in one of our early episodes because that's where I got a text about the Vanity Fair article. And actually, I've meant to share, I took a picture of the slot machine because I was like, I have to remember this for the rest of my life. And I will post that on Instagram. But the slot machine is a repetitive thing. And what you do enjoy about it, and certainly what I enjoy about it, is when you're playing an animated game, when you win something, the characters come alive. And all of a sudden, you have something if you have the sense of like, I've made a movie, I'm part of something happening. But there's gambling that has skill. So it's quite
You know
different.
when you pull down the lever,
Yes,
right, you either win or you lose.
correct. It's
And so
50-50.
and gamblers are hyper superstitious, right? Like if I pull down the thing and I win, like the gods of gambling have, smiled ambiguously upon me. Or if
Yes,
I lose, I'm pissed off. Like,
yes.
luck is basically a kind of like degraded theological concept.
Absolutely.
Uh,
I think that's very true. And I think that does happen with the slot machines. There's definitely slot machines are not the best way to gamble. You really should have a top. You should, $20. Don't go more than that. If you win, you win. But something like poker is quite different because that does entail skill. So, and that seems to be the game that McCarthy did be fascinated by. He certainly got the coin toss in his motifs, but he also has cards in his motifs. And with poker, there's a skill, and it's the skill to fold as much as to have a good hand or bet on a good hand and bet properly. You also have the skill of when to get out. So it's not all fate. It's not all dumb luck.
well,
But
yeah, like I think, I don't know astrology very
mm,
well.
mm,
But in astrology, first of all, you have to like make connections between individual stars to form constellations. And then, so you read the constellations out of the arrangement of the stars, and then you read another, and then on top of that, you read fate out of the constellations. And, so navigation is also like there may be like horizontal navigation. Oh, the star is in this position, so I've got to go westward. But there's also that kind of vertical navigation. It's like, well, I have these problems in my life. Let me read the stars, and they're in these positions, so that will say this about my fate. And the same thing with the tarot deck, right, or the cards, right? In whatever form you lay out your cards, it tells some kind of a story, right? And that story is about it has counsel, or it has wisdom in it, because the story is about not what you're fated to do or what's coming, but this is the situation. These are the potentials in this situation. Now you must, you know, navigate through there. So there is this element of escaping fate in astrology and
yeah,
tarot. I think that is important
yeah.
to think
And I
into.
think also too, it can sort out trauma. It can sort out stress. I mean, I certainly played
Oh
the
my God,
Jane
yes.
I Ching for a long time. And the way the I Ching, once you play it for quite a long time, you you start to see the poetry in it and how it is a repetitive thing. It is very interesting, the construction of those stories. It would be hard for me to not imagine that McCarthy would enjoy that too. But the tarot works in a similar way where there's these repetitive storylines and you're doing different combinations of them. And having that just to go through can be very relief when you're feeling stress. I know I took some relief from it when I went through stressful times in my life. And I mean, I came out of them and I was like, I don't want to do this again. I didn't even remember why it was so compulsive to me I've got to go I've got to go do the I Ching. But
You know, like Philip K. Dick used the I Ching to write
correct.
The Man in the High Castle
I
and
do know that.
came to like have an antagonistic relationship with the I Ching, kind of like again personified, the force behind it. And it's like, why did you make me decide to take my novel in this direction?
I didn't know that story until, fairly recently. But I had all gone through the I Ching quite in my 20s when you're tumultuous, you're young. And I was like, oh, and I was really into Carl Jung had written the famous foreword for it. And it was in art school. So I was doing it. But after a while, I was like, no, now I see through it. It's almost like I saw, okay, it's a mountain one day, it's water here, okay, to water and mountain is good or bad, whatever. Yeah, so I could see why he did. And to also give up his agency to do that would be difficult. I do feel as if McCarthy might have used the tarot card to construct Blood Meridian, though. I think there's a strong possibility he did. I doubt there be evidence of it, but there might be. I don't know what's out there, but certainly it would be a great storytelling structural device. You know, um,
Yeah.
it has occurred to me that he might have. I think he took it, enough seriously as a storytelling device to have respect for it. Whether he believed in it mystically or not, I don't know. But it's not really. It's more like brain cleaning then I see it as more a brain cleaning, same as the I Ching, rather than a mind wash, brainwashing. It's mind cleaning rather than brainwashing, if you will.
Yeah, it's a meditation technique, I think, in
Correct.
many ways. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
And yeah, sometimes you can't, you've got so many thoughts. You don't even have to be that stressed out. You've got so many thoughts. If you're a writer, it would be a great tool. But Philip K. Dick, I forgot about that story. He's probably burnt his I Ching. I wonder if he used sticks or coins. Probably used sticks.
Probably, yeah. I mean, I
Put them
think
in.
in the novel they use sticks.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So he probably did. I think the
Coins are easier.
coins are easier, and I think that's maybe more modern.
But yeah, this is so, like we've made it through the introduction of the novel, and
Right.
now we've really brought it on ourselves because everything going forward, there's just going to be
Yeah.
so much more, but
And I
it'll
guess
be
we're going to be part of it too. We're going to be, why are we reading this again? Yeah, no, we're definitely entering another form of spectacle. Yeah.
should be
This was a
amazing.
great chapter. It was a little chapter, but it really had some beautiful poetic things in it.
Yeah.
Yeah, some good writing in it.
Humor's there,
Oh,
the imagery is there, the rhetoric is there,
yeah.
the abasement and abjection is
It,
there, and
I feel
the
guilty that I like
terror
Toad.
is already there.
Right, I feel guilty I like Toad because he's a horse thief. He's probably not a good guy, but
Well,
you
the
know,
Comanches were horse thieves too, but
that's true. That's true. Yeah, that's a good.
Toadvine just got caught, I guess.
Yeah, true. I'd love to see them in the movie together, him and the kid.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you think he's like in his 20s, eh? I always kind
What
of
do you
thought
think
of
he
him
is?
as like older or something,
Oh,
but
I
I'm
don't
not sure.
know. I have no
Yeah.
idea. I mean, I'm just guessing that he's in his 20s.
Yeah.
I really don't know. It'd be interesting. You said your story was like 1854, the master's house. So it's not a real Toadvine. It's not as if he was all of a sudden in this.
Well, no, he might have been because like the Toadvine from the Master's house. So like he, he brutally kills the slave that he's obsessed with. But the owners of the slave take issue with that, and they want to hang Toadvine himself. an emphasis on hanging, right? Like Toadvine is in jeopardy of hanging.
Neat.
So, but his, benevolent, neither here nor there, boss, Mr. Mildmay, somehow intervenes in the kind of spontaneous lynching
Mm.
that Toadvine was going to be subject to, and so decided instead to put him on trial,
Oh
right?
God.
And this actually might have been a trial by jury.
Well, this tied
So
right back into what we've been talking about.
yeah, so what happens is that Toadvine is found innocent of, I guess destruction of property because it wasn't murder because it was a slave, right?
Mhm.
So he's found innocent, but the aggrieved party wants to kill him anyways, wants to hang him anyway. But nonetheless, Toadvine escapes. And the last thing we learn of Toadvine in this novel, The Master's House, is that, he's halfway down the Mississippi before anybody realizes, so he actually escapes. So maybe he escapes and goes, to Texas and then to Mexico.
Right. Right. Um, I'm trying to see if anyone's, I think you've really found a great piece of information on this source of Toadvine, especially like thematically. It's pretty amazing that there's so many relationships between them. Very cool. Very cool.
Yeah, there's probably more to say about that, but
There probably
we'll have
is.
to.
Maybe
Yeah.
I'll read it. I'll try and get a copy. I tried at the library, they didn't have it. Is it
Oh, it's
pretty esoteric?
I think you can just Google it. There'll be like a internet archive. It's
All
it's
right.
online. Yeah,
All
it's
right. Yeah.
readable online.
I went straight to the library. Silly me.
Oh.
I'm addicted to my library.
You like print books, do you?
I do.
Yeah, me
Well,
too.
because I'm lazy and I can lay down. I read a lot of books online, though. I really do. But I am lazy and I do like to lay on the couch and read.
A necessary
Yeah, I
laziness,
mean, if I
according
was
to
really,
T.S.
I
Eliot.
mean, I should probably just go straight for audio books, right?
Right, yeah.
But I like reading. Yeah. I listen to books on audio too. Whatever it takes, wherever they
That's
are.
right.
It's
Yep.
like you should watch um all items of pop culture on the original media they were meant to be watched. We watched War Games on video last night.
Oh yeah.
So if it was made on DVD, you should watch it on DVD. If it was made on for the film theater, watch it at the film theater. Well,
Well,
have
I
we?
guess
I'm sure we probably have 20 other things we wanted to talk about.
sure.
I know we had a
But
lot of notes, but I think we covered it. I feel like I
feels
did
like a
a
good
terrible
length.
I feel like I did a terrible job on distributed cognition, but I'll get chances again.
No, no, not at all. It's a
I'll
really
have to write
interesting idea.
something. I'll have to write something. Okay. Well, I'll talk to you soon.
Yes, I can hear my cat meowing
Oh
at the on the other end of a closed
my
door.
God.
So
And I've got dogs barking, my friend Trisha's dogs. Thank you for listening to our listeners. We
thank
are on
you.
social
Yes,
media on Instagram, and I will post a picture of my slot machine while I read the Vanity Fair
oh, good. Yeah,
article.
that's cool. I want to see that too.
I meant to do that weeks ago. And thank you for listening.
Thanks, everyone.
Please write a review on our podcast page. We would love it.
That would be amazing.
Would be.
And
Okay.
we'll see you next episode. Bye.
Yes, see you for now.